Hello, everyone. Welcome to another At the Movies with me and JT. It's been a little while. We had a little bit of a delay. I think May was a little bit of a busy month for both of us. But we did watch the movies.
We're still at the movies.
We're still at the movies. And now, I was gonna say the movies are back, but I actually haven't been to a movie theater yet. But
I have
but
been.
the movies are back.
I'm gonna say the movies are back after every theater screening that I go to this year.
I've been saying that about pretty much anything. Anytime that there's a movie that's announced that looks good, I'm like, oh, cinema is back. So that's just going to be my new thing for the rest of the year. Anyway, today we are talking about movies about video games. Now, to be point of clarification, not movies based on video games. So your Resident Evils, your Sonic the Hedgehogs, your
Mario Brothers,
your Warcrafts. Those are not here. That will be another video. We are going to do 2 gaming episodes of this show because JT and I have both very much been gamer mindset lately.
Just love gamer culture.
We do love the gamers, folks. So these are movies where gaming has a prominent place in the plot, but not about any particular video game. So the movies that we have to talk about in release order are WarGames, eXistenZ, Avalon, The King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters, Gamer, and Ready Player One. We're not really going to go one by one on these movies. We're kind of just going to talk more broadly about the representation of video games in movies, probably the relationship between the two mediums a little bit, and use these movies as jumping off points or points of example for talking about these things. So that's this video. That's what it's going to be. So where do we start? How do we jump into talking about gaming movies?
I feel like, I guess, I like how you framed it from, I like how you framed it going from the beginning, because I feel like a lot of the way gaming is represented in these movies is informed by the era, and we don't get, really, I don't know, too contemporary or too current, because I feel like a lot of video game movies are usually adaptations, and I think something like the earliest WarGames I think is the least.
It's barely about gaming, honestly, but it's more of a hacking movie than a gaming movie, really. It's more about hacker culture,
which is similar.
Yeah, I think it's the same realm, but
I think there is, and there's that overlap there that I think is important, especially related to gamer, because I feel so much of a part of gamer culture is related to the online and the interconnectivity of it. At a certain point, I think it becomes inexplicably linked. Gamer, in my mind, is probably, I think eXistenZ is probably the better movie, but I think Gamer gets it the most right for me in terms of synthesizing internet culture, the feeling of gaming, just generally kind of being dumb and fun and broy,
very male centric.
It hits all of those elements that I feel are inextricably linked to at least a contemporary presentation of gamer culture. I think that obviously it's a more diverse range than what is commonly represented, and that a lot of feelings and experiences of playing video games are different than the way they're commonly represented. But I feel like Gamer hits the nail on the head in that regard, where it's has a fast-paced aesthetic, does some like interesting things with like perspective.
Instead of looking like a video game, putting a lot of stock into looking like video games, which I think is something that Ready Player One does more, where
Yeah, absolutely.
the images on screen look like a contemporary video game. Gamer is more adapting the film form to the feeling of gaming. And I think that makes it extremely interesting. I know Gamer is, I think of the ones we watched, is like the most critically panned of all of them. And here we are once again, as we often do, upholding an unjustly maligned piece of film. Story-wise, I think it is perfectly good. I think it holds up as a satire and critique of not only gaming culture and internet culture, I think, and also of like Silicon Valley, like Mark Zuckerberg kind of tech guy stuff, in the wonderful villain of that movie, which I know we both love. Obviously, all of this stuff in the movie is like quite obvious and, you know, not very subtle, but I do think it's really good and like a more thoughtful treatment of that kind of subject matter than you usually get in movies that tackle these kinds of themes, like Ready Player One, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's like to bring the villain into it. I think the character that Michael C. Hall is playing in Gamer is like a great analog to the Halliday. Is that's
Yes.
the guy's name in
Yes, Halliday. Oh my god. Yeah, they're kind of like diametric opposites, but fundamentally the same kind of person.
Yeah, no, exactly. And of course, like to give Ready Player One credit, I do think there's a level of like corporate bureaucracy, like kind of being the enemy there that I think is like worthwhile. And it's like you have like this tech video game fantasy that happens in Ready Player One, but it's not like it's at the expense of like a dystopian like future. So I think that like I don't know. I think like I don't entirely hate Ready Player One. I think there are like some interesting aspects of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. To echo what you were saying about Gamer, it's just like it was panned because of like a frenetic like MTV style that I feel like is the I'm less interested in movies trying to like visually replicate like, oh, this looks like what you're seeing on the mise en scène on screen is like looks like a video game, as opposed to like watching this movie feels like playing a video game.
Yeah.
And I think that like Gamer does that like with like a first person shooter with like some of those like online sim style stuff that happens there in the middle very well. And I don't think that like I think by and large, because the majority of like video game movies are like just trying to like like aesthetically look like it, they wind up being less interesting because they're not like concerned with the feeling of that. And it's like, okay, well, how do you replicate like how do you replicate a first person shooter, or how do you replicate a platformer in a movie? And I mean, like, I think Gamer is one specific type of video game and like one specific type of video game culture, but it's like, I don't know, you could replicate like a platformer with like long takes to just like throw something out there off the top of my dome. But it's just what I would like to see, and I think what is like incredibly disappointing about like most of the gaming movies that we watched is they are concerned with the experience of it and trying to manifest that into a different medium. It's more of just like adapting a video game story.
And the whole reason why I think both of us are drawn to this topic, the relationship of films and video games, is because I do think that they have a relationship, these mediums, because I think video games over time increasingly adopt filmic qualities. With Ready Player One, I do think that the two, like, most interesting of the movies, maybe not most interesting, but the two, like, contemporary, I think Gamer and Ready Player One are, like, pretty good sort of anchors for this topic. Because with Ready Player One, the main, like, confliction that I have with that movie is that I do like a lot of things about that movie. I've seen it before. I saw it in theaters, and that was the last time I saw it before now. And I pretty much had the same reaction now as I did then, which is that there are parts that approach being interesting about video games. The computer effects and everything, I don't really like how they look, but because it is supposed to look like a contemporary video game, it is, like, kind of fun to watch in that sort of way.
I think there's definitely some Spielberg swag present in the movie.
Sure. I think if this were just some, like, random ass director, I think it would have just been, like, pure garbage. I do think Spielberg has some interest in the subject matter that makes it more interesting, but the problem I have with it is, by the nature of its narrative, it is filled with two things that a lot of movies now have, which is lots of, like, kind of garish, photorealistic, like, mind-numbing computer animation that is just, like, fills the screen with shit all the time. And, like, corporate IP showing up. And lots of nostalgia. And I mean, that's, like, a huge part of the movie. Of, like, the story of the movie is that it's literally a whole game world made by this, like, if we're being honest, like, completely pathetic fucking loser, Halliday, who makes this whole game out of, like, his love of 80s and 90s pop culture, which, of course, like, the refurbishing and rehashing of 80s and 90s culture is, like, everything that's come out in the last 10 years. And so it has a lot of, like, nauseating pop culture references that a lot of movies do now. And the movie seems to just, I don't know, the problem I have with it is that the movie seems to celebrate and indulge in that stuff more than it, like, has anything interesting to say about it. It ultimately ends with this sort of, like, very flat milquetoast, like, the kids will save the world kind of message, where they have the confrontation with Ben Mendelsohn, the villain, where, you know, they accuse him of being a fake fan, essentially, of being, you just reference 80s and 90s shit because you're a corporate sellout and you know that this sells, and not because you actually have any not because you're not a real gamer, you're not a real fan of pop culture, which, that's the thing that I don't really like about Ready Player One, is that it does kind of romanticize and portray positively this kind of, like, obsession with, you know, your childhood media.
No, I think it's like I think it's interesting and a bad movie because for the most part, because it is a reflection of that type of aspect of gamer culture.
It's more just because I know, and I knew this when I saw it in theaters and listening to the audience reactions, because I saw it with an audience that loved it. Whatever you want to say about anything Spielberg might have to say about any of this that could be interesting about this phenomenon of pop culture and of gaming culture and everything, at the end of the day, for the audience, it's just another indulging of that. It's just another movie that they go see where they go, I know what this shit is! And that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
And the movie plays more to that than, like I said, has anything interesting to say about any of it.
Well, I mean, I think playing into it, like in and of itself, whether intentional or not, like does offer some uh offer some commentary. And I do think the fact that I mean, I don't really have like any particular attachment to the Iron Giant movie, but I do think it is interesting to see a bunch of pop culture signifiers stripped of context
Well, yeah,
the
like
way that
the
they
Shining
commonly do. Yeah,
sequence
exactly.
is probably the best example.
And it's like that um I don't know. I feel like is a great reflection of like gaming culture signifiers, because I think a lot of what um a lot of the, or I mean, at least certainly what is marketed is just like, oh, and why I think video games and movies have like a very similar mode now at the point, because it's like you have an established franchise and you like that's it. And I think probably like a negative like quality to both mediums is that it's like you like something gets established and big, and then it's just pumping out more of that because we know it
Yeah.
makes money, as
Right,
opposed to
right.
like doing more experimental and like adventurous things. I mean, obviously, I think there can still be a focus on like fun in both mediums while being like adventurous. Like I think Gamer is like a hilarious and like great ride of a movie that's
Yeah.
fun and is also like aesthetically ambitious and like experimental in like having like an MTV style,
Yeah.
and like that's why it was like panned. To delve into like a critique of like video gaming stuff is that I think that um and I mean even friends of mine who are more heavy gamers, I think complain about like there being like a limited typeset of video games, or like obviously there was the big boom of like uh first person shooters that I feel like is still to some extent around, but when I was in like high school I feel like that was like all like really anyone played or like popped off and was popular. And yeah, I don't know it. um I mean, in both instances I think like consumer popularity and like money is like a driving factor in that.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that's what makes Ready Player One at the same time interesting and disappointing for me, is how much it indulges in this thing that encompasses not just video games but just pop culture in general. And it's just images for the sake of it. It's just things to be quoted and things to be referenced is what everything has kind of been stripped down to, you know? And I think within Ready Player One there is an interesting movie about that phenomenon. But I think Ready Player One, as a piece of pop culture itself, is too wrapped up in being an example of that and a proponent of that. And I think Gamer is an interesting antidote to it. That's a movie where you can, that indulges in the culture that it critiques while also offering a meaningful critique of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you enjoy
Because
the
yeah, at the
sequences where Jerry Butler is like shooting people up, but
right,
like it
right,
is like I think what's interesting in Gamer is it's like you're adapting real people to video games, and like
right,
what you're doing has like real world repercussions. And I
yeah,
think like like comes out at a perfect time to be like representative of like Obama era drone strike policy and how video games like play into that, where it's just like
right,
you're
right,
like like through the idea of like playing something like a video game, you're less connected to it, and like you're willing to do things that you couldn't do in real life. You're
yeah,
manifesting a different body. And I think there like eXistenZ explores I mean, obviously it's fucking Cronenberg. He's like fucking obsessed with like body horror and body stuff.
right,
But I think like eXistenZ, I mean, well, I would say less, like, I mean, comes out of like a weird time, like 99. I feel like it's hard for it to like get into gamer culture and gamer stuff like
Yeah, it doesn't
that
feel contemporary,
explicitly.
but
Um, but the way it approaches like stepping outside of your own body and sort of modifying your body with video gaming is interesting.
yeah, I do think eXistenZ and Gamer have a sort of similarity in terms of investigating the sort of consequences. eXistenZ, I would say, more philosophically, and Gamer more politically, honestly, of gaming, like you said, of taking control of another body. I think it's interesting, and it makes sense to me that almost all of the games I said earlier, I keep calling these things fucking games. I said earlier that almost all the movies we watched are virtual reality games, are at the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other similarity is that almost all of them are very militaristic.
Yeah.
And I think what you said about the Obama drone strike thing, I think is extremely relevant, because there seems to be, all the way going back to WarGames, the first movie that we watched that is, pretty old,
Yeah.
is this connection between gaming and war, which I think is really interesting. And I think it just has a lot to do with, I haven't like fully formed this thought or anything, so I'm just kind of
No, riff it out.
I'm just kind of riffing, but I do think it's interesting, considering how, if you think about, obviously there are lots of types of games, there are lots of types of gamers. This isn't necessarily true of every video game. I mean, I certainly play plenty of games that don't, have a bunch of violence, but most popular games, the object is to do violence to people. And in a lot of them, specifically, and I know that it is a franchise that is a very easy target of criticism and scorn. I'm not meaning to do that right now, but Call of Duty is, one of the most forget games, one of the most popular media franchises of all time. Not only explicitly about the military, but made in consort with the military, in terms of the weapons, and the machinery is, designed and made. The games are made with the, cooperation of the military to be, realistic and everything.
And I think that like the link that you're talking about between like gaming and militarism here is like different, like significantly different than like the classic like conservative like horror of like, oh, my son is playing bully or playing GTA and they're gonna like buy a hooker or like punch someone in the face.
The idea that, the whole like Jack Thompson murder simulator kind of thing,
because I feel like it's like
not what I mean by any of this.
No, I think that like what happens here is like there's a particular type of like valorization, like it just plays into like larger cultural issues of like, I mean particularly in American culture, of like valorization of the military and like military violence that like and with
masculine violence, revenge and stuff like that.
I'm not
and
saying
just
that
in general, achievement and domination are like key components of video games.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that like necessarily like it would be fun to play a video game where it's like you have like a Call of Duty game where it's like there are real life consequences to the crime, to the murders you're committing,
where or you like do whatnot, or like strikes.
Yeah, where like I don't know, you play a level like 30 years later where you're wrestling with the dreams of the men you killed in Iraq. But like I don't know, I think it's certainly something to like, there are more experiences that could be represented or more experiences that could be simulated that I think are like I don't know. And again, it's like I think a lot of this will fall into like a critique of like mainstream game culture and like
Yeah.
mainstream film culture where it's just like you're like on an aesthetic and I feel like a narrative level, you're just like so limited by like what has been proven to make money and what
Yeah.
is like proven to be popular, and
Yeah.
they're like beholden to that. And like with games it's really frustrating, I would say, like more so than movies, because it's just like you have indie game companies and stuff like that, but it's not it's harder to make a game than it is like a movie.
I would
And
say so.
you can't like I think to build out like a complex and like intricate game that like is I mean can be like a type, like I think you could even do something with like a first person shooter and like have a unique take on it, or do whatever. I'm just saying that it's harder for that experimentation to exist because you see that like these companies and the way they're crafting these games, especially like the worker conditions in some instances are so terrible, and it's built on satisfying like previously established expectations. So in some way it's giving you more of the same.
I think there's a tendency to uh, categorize video games as a particularly pernicious uh, medium. And I think a big part of it is because of how much of it is violent and how much of it is based on domination. And even if you're not going to do something as explicitly, something like Call of Duty or whatever, even something as simple as, you know, like a Mario game still has, on a psychological level, it's still about like fulfilling, I mean, like giving your brain the feeling of completing tasks without actually doing anything in the real world as we know it. But I do think that a lot of the most pernicious elements of gaming and gaming culture, and specifically like violent games, has much more to do with the underlying culture and conditions that the medium comes out of than with the medium itself. Because I think the medium itself has an amazing amount of room for possibilities. When did video games get really popular? In the 80s. Like the most reactionary decade of American culture ever. So, like, the fact that a lot of the, and I mean even the 90s were extremely reactionary. Like, so the fact that a lot of the like foundational formal elements of video game culture that we recognize now were all set in stone during that time. I mean, you also look at the movies that came out around that time, and you can really see that kind of cultural current. And then you think about the fact that gaming culture kind of, at a certain point, developed in tandem with early internet culture of, you know, the late 90s and early 2000s, where it was still considered like a pretty niche thing to be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you end up with most of the earliest champions of gaming and the people who kind of set the course for gaming culture and you know, came up with the lingo, made things popular, like, are mostly, you know, smelly dudes who don't fuck. And yeah.
I mean,
of course, now that's like extremely stereotypical. Everyone and their mom plays video games now, etc. But yeah,
I mean, I think like what you were getting at earlier about the link of like lack of like experimentation and style of games. I think like it just molds so perfectly with like film, where it's
yeah,
just like you and I, not for this, but I feel like a movie that like flows perfectly into like video game aesthetic is Gemini Man. And
yes, we
it's
did
like
watch Gemini Man
they're
recently.
are like that's like an experimentation with digital cinema, and like Ang Lee is a director who's like clearly interested in digital as a medium.
The possibilities digital cinema presents.
Exactly. And it's like um contemporary filmmakers and contemporary like game makers, I think, are less compelled in those directions, and like the marketplace doesn't reward people when they try and do that publicly. I mean, because like you can do that and whiff and like have it turn out bad, but I think it's still like worthwhile to be working towards like new experiences and like playing with the medium. And I think you mentioned even earlier that how like I mean less like aesthetically, but how movies imitate video games and how video games imitate movies. And I think one of the worst trends in video games is them trying to be like overly narrative and like overly like they well like there's this a thing where it's like, well, video games are, like have hyper realistic like graphics now like movies can. And like why do they need to have a realistic aesthetic? But like even beyond that, it's like you take this realistic aesthetic and then it's like, well, it needs like story structure to get people invested. It's like people like come for these types of things and like these types of experiences, and I think it really limits the types of pleasure that you can get out of like both, because it's like with watching a movie or like with playing a video game, it's like you have this profound opportunity there to experience some like visual pleasure, and with games like more experiential and like personify a body and doing things that are like beyond reality, and you cut yourself off from the I don't know. I think the most frustrating part about all of this, and like why we didn't have that large of a crop of movies to pick from, is that the range is severely limited, and they're like the people who are venturing into experimentation are sort of shunned from mainstream success.
Yeah, and also movies and video games are increasingly, especially if you want anything with any amount of exposure or production value, are increasingly time-consuming and expensive to make.
Yeah.
So it's very prohibitive to people who may have a more outlandish idea that may not have a big ROI. The more recent turn toward photorealism and having a more realistic aesthetic in its effects and its animation, I think they limit both of them. They kind of undermine the specific formal qualities of both mediums that make them interesting. For film is a visual medium. So the idea that anything that has effects or has a budget behind it needs to have a realist aesthetic. And I don't just mean with CGI, I mean in how things are filmed, and how things look. We've talked a lot about the sort of digital sheen that a lot of movies have, and especially streaming stuff has now. I think that limits the medium because, again, the appeal of movies is visually presenting things that you can't see, usually, you know?
Yeah. It's
giving you experiences outside of reality for the most part.
Yeah.
And with video games, it's more, like you said, experiential. And so with video games, I think the games that are the most interesting and the ones that advance the medium the most are the ones that play with the interactivity and explore that element of it. Because video games are an even more subjective medium than films are, because I mean the literal moment-to-moment experience of it will be different for everyone. Mm-hmm. Even if you're following the same story, if you're doing the same missions, you still, you are controlling it. Not only the visual photorealism, but the video games adoption of film narrative techniques and wanting to be more explicitly narrative, I think is inherently limiting. And the best way that I can frame that is the progression of Rockstar Games, who made Grand Theft Auto. Earlier Rockstar games like GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas. One of my favorite things about those games is that, they're open world games, and the missions, when you get missions, most of them are drive to a place and kill a guy. But especially in 3 and Vice City, and in a lot of places in San Andreas, other than the goal, except in some places, but for the most part, other than the goal itself, how you go about it is completely up to you. As you play Rockstar games over time, they keep putting more and more limitations on the ways you can play things out. They get much more linear, and I think Red Dead Redemption 2 is a really, even though a lot of people think it's a really good game and everything, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad game, I think one of its major weaknesses is when it comes to the actual missions. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on how huge the world is and how, how you can tailor your experience, your cowboy experience, to how you play the game. But when it comes to the actual story, the missions, the parts of the game you're supposed to play, it's incredibly linear, to the point that, they even, put on the map, you need to go to this specific spot so that you can trigger this cutscene that we made, which looks like a movie, and then so that we can put you in the spot where you shoot people, and you shoot people in basically a shooting gallery segment, and then you are directed to the next little dot that you need to stand on so that we can give you the next piece of exposition that looks like a movie. And it's it's not that there's anything wrong inherently with a game that's like that. I definitely know of several games that I enjoy playing that are very linear and basically just put you on rails and you play through it. That can be interesting and fun in and of itself.
But there's already so much of that.
Especially with an open world game, which are becoming increasingly ubiquitous over time, to the point that even games that don't really need to be open world are open world now. I feel like and with GTA specifically, I mean, GTA to me has always represented the height of just the chaos of gaming, of there's a story, but you can do whatever you want. I think 98% of the people that both of us know who play GTA probably spend the majority of their time just fucking around in the game and not doing the story. You want to see mediums play to their strengths. With films, it's the visuals. With video games, it's the play and the interactivity and the experience. And I think that both of them have been caught in this cultural current that I think limits them. And I also think it leads to movies about video games that are kind of limited in what they think they can do. Not in what they can do, but in what the people making them think they can do. And if the only people who are big-brained enough to figure it out are Neville Dean or the Crank guys. So I don't know what that says, but...
One I do want to talk about that I feel like is interesting in terms of what we're talking about, just is a little bit of a different avenue, was King of Kong, because I think
I wanted to spice it up, do something else. It's a documentary. For those who don't know, King of Kong is a documentary about the competition between Steve Wiebe? I think it's Wiebe. And Billy Mitchell, who since this movie has had his high score for Donkey Kong revoked. He cheated. He actually, the one that he submitted, the one that he calls in and sends in a tape, and it's total bullshit even then, to Twin Galaxies. It's so funny, by the way, when I watch this movie, I don't give a fuck about any of these things with the Donkey Kong high scores, but when I'm watching the movie and Billy Mitchell does something, I'm like, that's fucking bullshit. But Yeah, that one that he called in, that they were like, there's the weird edit that they were like, oh, that might be weird, but they passed it anyway.
Yeah.
He did it on an emulator. It wasn't on an
Oh
actual
shit.
cabinet. So yeah, that was like 2 years ago. They figured that out. And Walter Day, I think that's his name, the ref, who's hilarious. I love that he wears a referee outfit. The ref is implicated in this as knowing this and deliberately doing this to, boost the persona of Billy Mitchell, who I do think is like. I think you like this movie less than I do. I've known about the movie for a long time, and
Well,
I've
I
been a fan
watched
of
it
it.
when I was younger, and I do like it. I mean, it's just something like I
It's a
like it.
very amateurish documentary,
Yeah,
like as
no,
a movie.
that's I think the main hang up for me is just that it's like I don't think like certainly the presentation of it isn't anything like revolutionary or amazing, but I think that like I don't know, it is an insanely funny and compelling story,
Yes.
and in terms of what we're getting at here with video game stuff, I think like is great at representing like the generally obsessive like cultural aspects, like the type of, and especially it's dude
There's
heavy.
also like
It's
no
like
women in that movie at all.
yeah, no,
It's
it's
just
just like
all like dumpy guys in their
yeah, like
40s
dumpy guys who are obsessed with like an ancient
with
fucking game.
35-year-old games. Yeah,
Just to like I don't know, and like a perpetual pissing contest for like
pretty much.
for no one other than just to like
Just bragging rights. Like
yeah,
you don't get anything.
just to have said that they're the one who's number one. And it's
They're
like
the best.
obviously you like you spend time like I don't know, you can look at my obsessions from a similar lens and I'm sure like mock and critique them, but I think that I don't know, it represents like especially with video game culture and like the amount of stock that people take into it, it is like virtual achievement, and like there is something where it's like I do think there can be like meaningful achievement, and I do think that like obviously like the mere notion of us having a conversation about video games I think should imply that I do think that they have a place and a valuable function, but again, it's like you're not actually doing anything like by playing a video game, like, and that type of obsession like is I don't know, you're I think in a way is like kind of similar to like drugs and alcohol, and it's like you're experiencing a pleasure that is not like it's in your head, and I don't know. I think King of Kong taps into the type of, I mean, in like pop culture obsessives in general are like
Yeah.
that type of person where it's like you're I don't know, somehow the time goes by and you're just a dude just who has wasted so much fucking time playing Donkey Kong.
Yeah. Well, I like the movie because there's a certain even though obviously there's all sorts of stuff about cheating in the game in the movie and afterwards, there is a sort of purity of competition
Yeah.
because it is literally just for bragging rights. I think they're incredibly interesting in the context of gaming culture because on the one hand you have someone like Steve Wiebe who's just kind of like a loser.
It's the
He
Virgin versus the Chad.
It is the classic Chad versus the Virgin, and of course the Virgin wins. Where Steve is more, they talk about at the beginning how he's not really like the best at anything that he does. He's tried a lot of things, but I think his adeptness at King Kong at fucking Donkey Kong, comes from his like ability to analyze patterns and his quickness with his hands, and I like that. I think that's an interesting dynamic in the context of what we're talking about with gaming culture, where you have the sort of underdog who's really the reason that he's good and the reason that he's amassed a rep in this game is because of his like total mastery of the technical aspects of a game.
Yeah.
And I like thinking about, especially, and obviously it's much easier with like more sort of simple and crude arcade games than it might be with modern games, but I mean, knowing people, having friends who are in like the speedrunning and modding communities of various games now, like modern games, it still is definitely a thing where there is a large segment of gamers where the appeal of games is that they are just mechanical programs. You know, they are like, they're things that you can crack, you can break them, you can figure out how they work, and you can kind of reverse engineer them either to be the best at them or to just completely break them and make something new, which is what, you know, you think of like hacks of games is kind of the end point of that. You literally taking the bones of a game, like it, you know, its code and its elements, and making something else. Versus Billy Mitchell, who's purely in it for the stature and for the notoriety, which is on the one hand is like, you know, it's as gross and, you know, and ambitious as any other kind of person like that in any other field or area of interest. But it's Billy Mitchell's pathetic in his own way, because at the end of the day, it's like, who gives a shit? Like, the maximum number of people who will care about his achievement is pretty small. How much stock he puts in his own image and his own persona,
Absolutely,
is really funny. And yeah, and I mean, video games, you know, in kind of an obvious way, are inherently competitive, you know, and I think that also kind of I mentioned there are no women in the movie, and I say that kind of derisively, but I don't mean it in, you know, I'm not meaning it in like a Bechdel test kind of way where,
yeah,
you
no,
know,
exactly. It doesn't make it good or bad.
Right, but I do think it's interesting, and I mean, I am a person who kind of pushes back against the notion of gaming being a male thing, or gaming culture being a male thing. But I do think, you know, obviously, like competition, domination, I just bumped my mic, sorry. Competition, domination, these are stereotypically male things. Things associated with masculinity. And I don't know. Like I said, I don't have anywhere I'm really going with this, but I do think that King of Kong presents an interesting thing where it is this, like, it's a bunch of boys just trying to, like you said, a pissing contest, just who's the best, and
Yeah, and
but
I think
taken to absurd lengths. And,
it's funny because it's like I don't know, a lot of, I think, what, like, in classical, like the gamer culture we're talking about, of like the early 2000s, like kind of like 4chan guys style stuff that evolved out of, like, I guess, like like the nerd archetype.
That is now all pop culture.
Yeah.
Everything is like nerd and baby stuff.
I feel like it's this idea. I mean, it's the realm for the beta to be the alpha. And I mean, you see it like in
The
this.
nerds
It's like,
won.
it's like, it's still that, like, I don't know, because I think it's like a lot of the time, the representation, or like self-representation of like these types of dudes who are like not traditionally masculine, or like, oh well, I care, I'm sensitive, I'm like gentle or whatever, but it's like, no, it's like still like masculine, like in masculine impulses that they're playing into, which is not like a bad thing. Like, I don't like, not inherently, but it's just like, just in the way that they can, like they adapt their own little competition, and I don't know, fight in that arena where, but I don't know, I think some of the earlier stuff that you mentioned about, like, there being, like,
it's athleticism, it's athletic it's football for people who like to sit.
Exactly. And what you were saying earlier,
and
about,
it gives
like,
you just as much brain damage.
The technical proficiency of it, I think, is something that is interesting with, like, King of Kong, because it's like, I don't know, it's in, I wouldn't say like a particularly I mean, it's more explicit than our other movies about gaming, but I think it tackles like the feeling of playing, or just sort of like developing that skill. I mean, I think
Not so much in
eXistenZ,
a formal way, but in a,
yeah,
subject matter.
representing it like
Yeah.
physically, and I think that's
I
interesting.
mean, it's a lot of watching people play video games, so
Yeah.
literally, yeah.
And I don't know. I think it is, while we didn't talk about it as much in the first half because it's like not a fiction film about video games and is sort of its own right, I think it like wraps into all of it like perfectly for that reason.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, what better way to see like gamer culture than to examine two titans,
The gamers.
the gamers themselves. Turn your eye to the
gamers
gamer
themselves. Yeah, exactly. I think that we've covered this pretty well at this point.
Yeah, and I imagine our conversation about like video game movies will delve into similar things and offer us areas to expand.
Anything about, especially the relationship formally between movies and games, I think will come out more in the movies based on games video, which I think that's just going to be the next one we do, right?
Yeah.
I feel like it should be.
Yeah.
I'm still in gamer mode, so we might as well just do that next. So, probably at this rate, more beginning of July than end of June is when that one will be coming out. That's what we're going to try to do from now on. It's been kind of sporadic so far, but we're going to try to do beginning of each month. Is when we do a new one of these. Next time is going to be mostly shit. Probably almost exclusively shit next time, because as many of you know, most movies based on video games are very bad. So we'll be watching some of those next time. But thank you all for watching. Thank you, JT, as always, for hanging out. And see you guys next time.